The Night of the Hunter is an American film directed from 1955, directed by Charles Latin and Stanley Cortez. This film is obscure. Latin says so himself, a weird Mother Goose tale. Peter Kimpton, in his article from The Guardian, says a children's fairy tale, strange and idiosyncratic, but also a noir thriller, laced with the darkest elements of both genres, death, guilt, greed, poverty, cruelty, biblical references, and a terrifying pursuit by the scariest of boogeymen. Be prepared for a wild story with a suspenseful plot that will get you sitting at the edge of your seat for 93 minutes, or in Latin's terms, sit up real straight. But first, let's talk about cinematography. The director Latin uses some cool techniques in the story that makes us recognize and remember key characters, items, and places in the film that are important to the story. These include, but are not limited to, shot types and implied proximity, three-point lighting, and that being key light, fill light, backlight, as well as familiar imagery. The main techniques I picked up while watching The Night of the Hunter was the lighting and familiar imagery. It reminded me of Orson Welles' film Citizen Kane, the dynamic use of lighting and shadows and tons of familiar imagery. When Kane looks down, casting a large shadow over his wife Susan, he's displaying his dominance over her. We can see that because of the lighting, but also because of the storyline. This is a super intense scene, just like this one in today's film, when little John Harper is covered and engulfed by an enlarged shadow of Reverend Harry Powell, played by Robert Mitchum. This is a foreshadowing, pun intended, of the character of the dominant Reverend Powell, the boogeyman, the villain, the real bad guy in this fairy tale. Familiar imagery is in any reappearing image that reoccurs in a movie to help stabilize the narrative. For instance, this is a collage of frames Cortez uses as familiar imagery. A welcoming, warm image of a household. Harper's house, and towards the end, Miss Cooper's house. It seems to me that we are always brought back home at the end of the day. A lot happens inside those houses during this film. Next up, we see Pearl's famous raggedy old doll that was stuffed with the hidden $10,000 from her dad. Throughout the story, as little John and his precious sister Pearl escape from their insane stepfather, this doll shows up again and again along the way. I mean, it's the most significant image throughout the whole film, since it's the object of Reverend Powell's hunt. Not to forget this famous imagery in the Harper Powell household in the newlyweds' room. Safe to say, it was a troublesome marriage early on. This is a familiar perspective of the room and the interaction with the couple. The first and last scene is what stuck out to me the most. Here we see John's dad under arrest for stealing a lot of money. And at the end, we see Reverend Powell chased down by the state troopers for being a stalker and a real creep. This first frame is John in the beginning when his dad is getting arrested. Yikes. Next is John in shock when Reverend Powell gets arrested. In both the beginning and the end, John holds his stomach like he's going to be sick. He falls down to his feet at his dad and later his stepdad's side and begs the troopers not to take him. Poor John. He had to experience his own dad and getting taken away right in front of him, and it happens again to the very, not so good male figure in his life too. He can't help but reminisce and feel emotional about this reoccurring instance. The audience shares this emotional experience with John too. Smart of Cortez to do this here. Familiar images appear in the film to remind us of significant memories, items, or individuals. We are experiencing this instance again with John, which adds emotional depth of our perspective and relationship with the character. The Night of the Hunter is an American... To remind you of another instance familiar images are used is in Bartholomew's Song, directed by Destin Cretton, released in 2006. In a society strict with repetition, Bartholomew's discovery of a music box leads him to embarking on a small journey to break the system. The audience can recognize the significance of this music box and the shape of the speakers because it's everywhere. We see it all the time. Citizen Kane does this also. This first frame on the left is of Mr. and Mrs. Kane signing off to Mr. Thatcher and young Kane playing outside the window in the background. This is not only an excellent example of deep focus where there are three main focuses, but this character set up deep focus and the window will show up again. See? Deep focus. Thatcher, a businessman, and Kane are all in the frame. Kane in the back near the window. This is Mr. Thatcher and Leland discussing their worries about Kane and his tendencies. Ironically, he's blowing smoke toward the window, which shows Kane's reflection. Neat cinematography, right? The Night of the Hunter has most definitely become one of my favorite American films. The storyline is engaging and the plot is intriguing and emotional. I'm a big fan of the content, but I guess the form is cool too. The use of lighting and familiar images make this a memorable film.